Picture this: a wealthy gentleman in fine clothes, living a life of comfort and privilege on his lush Barbados plantation, suddenly decides to leave it all behind. He doesn't choose to travel or to retire to a quiet country life. No, he chooses piracy. This is the story of Stede Bonnet, a man whose life took an astonishing turn from the refined halls of the elite to the brutal, lawless decks of a pirate ship. His journey is one of the most bizarre and captivating tales of the golden age of piracy, filled with unexpected twists, misadventures, and a quest for something far beyond his grasp. Stede Bonnet is not a name that echoes through history like Blackbeard or Captain Kidd, but his story is just as intriguing, if not more so. Known as the gentleman pirate, and sometimes even as the worst pirate you've never heard of, Bonnet's life was a strange blend of contradiction and ambition. He was a man born into wealth and privilege, a prosperous landowner with every reason to live out his days in peace. And yet, he chose a different path. A path fraught with danger, excitement, and a fair share of folly. What would drive a man to abandon a life of luxury for the perils of the pirate's life? Was it madness, a midlife crisis, or something deeper that pushed him to the seas? Welcome to the ASMR History Hub. Here, we blend the soft whispers of storytelling with the rich tapestry of history to take you back in time. As you listen to the calming sound of my voice, imagine yourself aboard a pirate ship, feeling the gentle sway of the ocean beneath you. This is a place where history comes alive, where each whisper carries you deeper into the past, and where today we will uncover the strange and fascinating life of Stede Bonnet. Settle in, relax, and let's embark on this journey together, discovering the life of a man who defied the expectations of his time and chose a path that was as perilous as it was peculiar. Bonnet's story stands out in the annals of piracy because it defies the typical narrative. Unlike most pirates, who are often driven to their profession by necessity, poverty, or a life on the run, Bonnet made a conscious, almost whimsical decision to become a pirate. He wasn't a hardened sailor or a desperate fugitive, but a well-to-do planter who decided to buy a ship, hire a crew, and set sail under the Jolly Roger, as if it were just another hobby for a gentleman of means. His lack of experience and his series of bewildering decisions would earn him his notorious reputation. How does a man go from plantation owner to pirate? What could possibly lead him to trade the tranquility of his estate for the chaotic life of the Caribbean's most dangerous profession? In this video, we'll explore the life of Stede Bonnet, taking you on a journey through his transformation from a wealthy plantation owner to a pirate captain whose misadventures were as numerous as they were peculiar. You'll hear about his unlikely partnership with Blackbeard, his struggles to lead a pirate crew with no knowledge of the sea, and the series of mistakes that made him a laughingstock even among other pirates. Yet, beyond the failures and the strange choices, we'll seek to understand the man himself, his motivations, his ambitions, and the restless spirit that drove him to the pirate's life. As we delve into the curious tale of Stede Bonnet, prepare to see a side of piracy that is often overlooked, the side where adventure meets folly, where the high seas call even to those who seem the least likely to answer. So, relax, listen closely, and let your imagination sail away as we begin our story with the early life of the man who would become the gentleman pirate. Stede Bonnet was born in 1688 in Bridgetown, Barbados, into a world of sunshine, sugar, and wealth. From his earliest days, he was surrounded by the lush greenery of his family's plantation, the sound of the Atlantic waves crashing nearby, and the sweet scent of sugarcane wafting through the air. The Bonnets were not just any family. They were among the wealthy elite of the island. Their plantations stretched as far as the eye could see, worked by countless enslaved people whose labour filled the Bonnets' coffers with the profits of sugar production. As one of the most influential families in Barbados, the Bonnets wielded power and influence in the region, and young Stede grew up with the expectations that came with such status. From an early age, Stede Bonnet was groomed to uphold the family name and legacy. His upbringing was one of privilege and comfort, shielded from the harsh realities of the world beyond the plantation gates. He was a child of the colonial elite, expected to maintain the family's wealth and social standing. The lifestyle he was born into promised a future of ease and respectability, but with that promise came the weight of expectation. Expectations that would shape his every step as he grew into adulthood. Bonnet's education, like that of many gentlemen of his time, would have been rigorous, designed to prepare him for a life of leadership and responsibility. He likely received a classical education, learning Latin, mathematics, and philosophy. Perhaps he even dabbled in the arts and sciences, acquiring knowledge that would mark him as a learned man among his peers. There may have been some military training as well, an essential part of a gentleman's education, teaching him the basics of strategy, discipline, and the martial skills necessary to defend his estate. Every lesson was a brick in the foundation of a life that seemed predetermined, a life of order, control, and societal duty. Yet, with this education came a set of rigid expectations. Stede Bonnet was not just any boy. He was heir to the Bonnet plantation, a vast enterprise that required a steady hand and a keen mind to manage. The weight of his family's social and economic status rested heavily on his shoulders. As the only son, it was his duty to continue the family's legacy, to protect their wealth, and to uphold their standing in the community. A life of propriety and responsibility was laid out before him, a path he was expected to follow without question. In 1709, Stede Bonnet married Mary Allenby, a match that was likely arranged to solidify social ties and further the interests of both families. As a husband and a plantation owner, Bonnet's life became a cycle of managing the estate, dealing with the complexity days on the plantation were filled with the hum of activity, overseeing the labour force, managing crops, and negotiating with traders. Nights were often spent in the drawing rooms of fellow planters, discussing matters of business, politics, and society. It was a life that, on the surface, appeared stable and predictable, but beneath this facade of stability there were cracks. The pressure to conform, to be the perfect gentleman, husband, and plantation owner weighed heavily on Bonnet. The life of a planter, while outwardly idyllic, was fraught with its own set of challenges and frustrations. The isolation of plantation life, the constant management of enslaved labour, and the never-ending pursuit of profit could be as stifling as it was monotonous. Even in his social circle, Bonnet may have felt like an outsider, his restless spirit at odds with the conformity expected of him. So, what could have driven Stede Bonnet, a man of considerable means and social standing, to abandon everything he knew and become a pirate? Some say it was discontent with his domestic life, a midlife crisis brought on by the pressures of marriage and the demands of managing a plantation. Others speculate that Bonnet faced financial difficulties despite his outward appearance of wealth. The sugar trade was a volatile business, and even the most successful planters could find themselves in dire straits due to market fluctuations or poor harvests. There are also whispers, passed down through the centuries, that Bonnet's decision to turn to piracy was the result of a deeper, more personal struggle. Some contemporary accounts suggest he may have suffered from mental health issues, or was driven by an inexplicable yearning for adventure. Perhaps he was seeking an escape from the crushing expectations of his social position, a way to break free from the confines of his prescribed life. Whatever the reason, it is clear that Stede Bonnet was a man searching for something more, something beyond the ordered world of his upbringing. And so, against all odds and logic, Stede Bonnet made a choice that would baffle historians and enthrall storytellers for centuries to come. He turned his back on the world of Barbados, the world of privilege and predictability, and set his sights on the wild, unpredictable life of a pirate. How does a man raised in the lap of luxury, with every reason to stay the course, decide to take such a dramatic turn? The answer lies in the next chapter of his life, where we explore the unlikely series of events that led him to don a pirate's hat and sail under the Jolly Roger. Stede Bonnet's decision to become a pirate was as baffling as it was bold. Here was a man of considerable means, a gentleman planter from Barbados, who suddenly turned his back on a life of comfort and respectability for the wild and dangerous world of piracy. This was not a decision born of desperation, as was often the case for many who found themselves aboard pirate ships. No, Bonnet's choice seemed to stem from a deep and inexplicable yearning for something more, something beyond the stifling expectations of his privileged existence. Rumours swirled around Bridgetown about his growing discontent, his his marital strife, and a restless spirit that couldn't be tamed by wealth or status? Was it a midlife crisis, a rebellion against the monotony of his life, or perhaps a desire to escape personal demons? Whatever the reasons, Bonnet made a choice that would alter the course of his life forever. In a move that shocked his contemporaries, Bonnet decided to finance his own entry into piracy. Using his wealth, he purchased a sloop that he christened the Revenge. This was no small endeavour. The Revenge was a modestly sized vessel, but for Bonnet it was a significant investment. The ship, equipped with 10 cannons, was relatively swift and manoeuvrable, designed more for speed than for heavy combat. Bonnet's decision to use his own money to outfit the ship and hire a crew was highly unusual in the world of piracy, where the norm was to capture ships and recruit willing or unwilling crew members from among the captured. But Bonnet, ever the gentleman, approached piracy as if it were a business venture. He paid his crew wages, rather than adhering to the pirate tradition of splitting plunder. This choice had profound implications for his leadership. In paying wages, Bonnet was trying to apply a structured, almost corporate approach to a world that thrived on chaos and shared risk. Pirates were notorious for their democratic practices. They chose their captains, divided loot among the crew, and followed a strict code that emphasised fairness and equal stakes. Bonnet's salaried approach disrupted these norms, creating an awkward dynamic between him and his crew. Some saw him as a fool, others as a naive novice playing at piracy without understanding its rules. The crew's loyalty was lukewarm at best, and Bonnet's inexperience soon began to show. Bonnet's initial voyages along the American coast were a series of missteps and missed opportunities. Lacking any real nautical experience, he struggled to navigate the treacherous waters of piracy. His first attempts at plunder were marked by indecision and a lack of tactical knowledge. He often hesitated at critical moments, missing chances to seize valuable ships, or worse, nearly getting captured himself. His crew, initially willing to humour their eccentric captain, grew increasingly frustrated with his poor decision-making. Bonnet's unfamiliarity with basic naval manoeuvres led to a string of near disasters, and it wasn't long before his reputation as an ineffective leader began to spread. One of his earliest failures occurred when he attempted to raid a merchant ship off the coast of Virginia. Misjudging the vessel's speed and the strength of its defences, Bonnet ordered an attack that ended in disaster. The merchant ship, heavily armed and well prepared, managed to repel Bonnet's crew with ease, inflicting significant damage to the Revenge and demoralising its crew. Bonnet, inexperienced and flustered, failed to issue clear orders, leading to chaos and confusion on deck. The crew's discontent grew as they realised their captain lacked the basic skills needed to succeed in their dangerous new profession. As if his lack of experience wasn't enough, Bonnet's attempts at leadership were undermined by by his insistence on maintaining certain gentlemanly airs. He dressed in fine clothes and tried to run his ship with a semblance of aristocratic decorum, which only served to alienate him further from his rough-and-tumble crew. They saw him as an outsider, a dandy playing at being a pirate, without any understanding of what it truly meant to live outside the law. His crew, accustomed to the egalitarian and often brutal world of piracy, chafed under his unconventional leadership style. They were not interested in wages. They wanted plunder, adventure, and a leader who could guide them to it. With each failed venture, Bonnet's standing among his men diminished. Stories of his ineptitude spread, earning him a reputation as one of the most ineffective pirate captains to sail the Caribbean. Even among the pirate community, which was known for its colourful characters and tolerance of eccentricity, Bonnet stood out as an oddity, a man out of his depth. Pirates were a pragmatic lot, and they quickly recognised that Bonnet was no natural seafarer. He was tolerated more for his novelty than for any actual ability to lead. Despite his many failures, Bonnet was not without a certain stubborn determination. He continued to sail, learning through bitter experience the harsh realities of pirate life. But his journey was far from smooth, and his leadership continued to be questioned at every turn. It seemed that every step forward was followed by 2 steps back, every small success overshadowed by a more glaring failure. Bonnet was becoming a caricature among pirates, a wealthy landowner who had bought his way into piracy without understanding its demands or its dangers. As Bonnet's reputation faltered and his crew's patience wore thin, a new chapter in his piratical career was about to unfold. The Caribbean seas, known for their unpredictability, would soon bring Bonnet into the orbit of one of the most feared and famous pirates of all time, Blackbeard. This unlikely alliance between the gentleman pirate and the notorious scourge of the seas would change the course of Bonnet's journey in ways he could never have imagined. The Caribbean was a vast, restless sea, filled with danger and opportunity in equal measure. For Stede Bonnet, now a floundering figure in the world of piracy, the waves brought more than just storms. They brought a fateful encounter with one of the most notorious pirates of the time, Blackbeard. The meeting between Bonnet and Blackbeard happened in the summer of 1717 off the coast of what is now North Carolina. Bonnet, nursing wounds from his many failures and growing increasingly isolated from his disgruntled crew, spotted a fearsome vessel approaching, the Queen Anne's Revenge. On board this imposing ship was Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, a seasoned pirate whose very name struck fear into the hearts of sailors across the Atlantic. From the moment Blackbeard's ship loomed on the horizon, the contrast between the 2 men was stark. Blackbeard was everything Bonnet was not, a commanding presence with a deep knowledge of the sea, skilled in the art of piracy, and respected by his men. He embodied the ruthless efficiency and calculated cruelty had become synonymous with piracy in the Golden Age. Bonnet, on the other hand, was still a gentleman by birth, a planter turned pirate, more out of whimsy or rebellion than necessity or skill. When Blackbeard boarded the Revenge, he immediately saw Bonnet for what he was, an amateur, a dilettante in the rough world of piracy. The initial interaction between Blackbeard and Bonnet was one of opportunism. Blackbeard, recognising Bonnet's inexperience and vulnerability, saw a chance to expand his influence and strengthen his fleet. For Bonnet, this meeting was a lifeline. He was captivated by Blackbeard's charisma and experience, perhaps seeing in him a mentor figure who could help him navigate the treacherous waters of piracy. Yet, this mentorship would come at a cost. A cost Bonnet was initially too naive to see. Before long, Blackbeard made a decisive move to take control of the Revenge. He suggested that Bonnet rest and recover from his wounds aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge, while Blackbeard temporarily took command of Bonnet's ship. This suggestion, though presented as an act of camaraderie, was anything but. Blackbeard swiftly asserted his authority, commanding Bonnet's crew with a blend of fear and respect that Bonnet had never been able to muster. Under Blackbeard's command, the Revenge transformed from a floundering vessel to a fearsome pirate ship, its crew now galvanised under a leader who knew how to wield power and instill fear. For Bonnet, this turn of events was a psychological blow. He had gone from being the captain of his own ship to a mere guest, watching as another man took the reins and led his crew to successes that he could only dream of. The humiliation of being sidelined on his own ship must have stung deeply. Bonnet, who had entered piracy in an attempt to seize control of his destiny, now found himself more powerless than ever, overshadowed by a figure whose very presence highlighted his own inadequacies. His authority diminished with every decision Blackbeard made, and Bonnet's role shrank from captain to bystander, his dreams of pirate glory slipping further from his grasp. Despite the power shift, the two pirates entered into a series of joint ventures that saw them working together on various raids. With Blackbeard at the helm, the newly invigorated crew of the Revenge joined the Queen Anne's Revenge in a campaign of terror along the American coast and into the Caribbean. They plundered merchant ships, spreading fear wherever they went. One of their most notable conquests was the capture of the Concorde, a large French vessel that Blackbeard promptly renamed Queen Anne's Revenge, marking it as the new flagship of his growing fleet. In these ventures, Bonnet's participation was mostly passive. While Blackbeard made bold decisions and led daring raids, Bonnet remained on the periphery, often relegated to the background. During these raids, Bonnet's role was little more than a figurehead. He was present, but rarely the driving force behind the actions of the crew. Blackbeard's dominance meant that Bonnet was overshadowed, his voice barely a whisper amidst the shouts of battle and the crew and other pirates, Bonnet's presence seemed increasingly superfluous. A gentleman playing pirate in a world where survival depended on ruthless cunning and decisive action. As the months passed, tension began to simmer between Bonnet and Blackbeard. Bonnet's growing frustration with his marginalisation was palpable, while Blackbeard's patience with his inexperienced counterpart began to wear thin. The alliance that had seemed mutually beneficial at first started to crack under the strain of Bonnet's incompetence and Blackbeard's unrelenting drive for power and control. Blackbeard, ever the pragmatist, saw little use for a partner who brought more liability than value. The breaking point came in late 1717 when Blackbeard decided to cut ties with Bonnet altogether. In a calculated move, Blackbeard marooned Bonnet and a few of his loyal men on a small island off the coast of North Carolina, leaving them with only limited provisions. It was a clear signal that their uneasy partnership was over. For Bonnet, this betrayal was both a personal and professional blow. He had been cast aside, left to fend for himself in a world where his noble background and gentlemanly demeanour offered little protection. Yet Bonnet's story was far from over. Marooned and desperate, he faced a choice: give up on his piratical ambitions and return to the life he once knew, or find a way to reclaim his lost honour and fortune on the high seas. The next chapter in Bonnet's tumultuous life would see him navigating not just the treacherous waters of the Caribbean, but also the legal and political complexities of a pirate seeking redemption. He would soon find himself at the mercy of colonial authorities, facing capture and, unexpectedly, a chance at pardon. After being marooned by Blackbeard, Stede Bonnet found himself in a desperate situation. Stranded on a desolate island with a handful of loyal men and scant provisions, his prospects looked bleak. But Bonnet was not one to easily surrender to fate. Driven by a mixture of pride, frustration, and an unyielding desire to prove himself, he managed to escape the island, commandeer a small vessel, and set out once more on the treacherous waters of the Carolina coast. His renewed efforts at piracy, however, were short-lived. It wasn't long before his ship, poorly equipped and undermanned, was spotted by colonial forces patrolling the area. Weary and disheartened, Bonnet found himself cornered with few options. The events leading to Bonnet's capture were swift and humiliating. His ship, now a shadow of its former self, was no match for the well-armed vessels of the colonial authorities. Faced with overwhelming odds, Bonnet made the reluctant decision to surrender. The crew, demoralised and hungry, offered little resistance as the authorities boarded their battered ship. Bonnet, once a gentleman planter turned pirate captain, now stood a prisoner in chains. News of his capture spread quickly, stirring a mix of curiosity and contempt among the public. Many saw him as a tragic figure, a misguided nobleman who had foolishly traded a life of privilege for one of crime and infamy. To the authorities, however, Bonnet was a symbol of the chaos responsibilities. In the midst of this disgrace, however, came an unexpected opportunity. The King's Act of Grace, a royal proclamation issued by the British Crown, offered pardons to pirates who willingly surrendered and pledged to abandon their life of crime. The act was part of a broader effort to suppress piracy by offering a way out for those who would renounce their ways. For Bonnet, the Act of Grace was a lifeline. He saw in it a chance to escape the gallows and perhaps reclaim some semblance of his former life. Seizing this opportunity, he formally petitioned for the pardon, expressing contrition for his actions and a desire to return to the lawful life he once knew. The authorities, eager to reduce piracy and restore order, granted his request. For a moment, it seemed as if Bonnet might truly turn a new leaf. With the royal pardon in hand, Bonnet made an earnest attempt to reform. He took on the guise of a respectable gentleman once more, retreating to a quiet life in the hopes of erasing the stain of his piratical past. But the transition was far from smooth. The life of a pirate, with its fierce independence and disdain for conventional norms, had left a mark on him that was not so easily washed away. Bonnet found himself caught between two worlds, neither fully at home in the structured, polite society of the gentleman, nor wholly accepted in the brutal, lawless realm of piracy. The discontent that had first driven him to the sea now festered again, a restless spirit yearning for freedom and adventure. The quiet life he had once been so eager to escape now felt like a prison of its own. Unable to reconcile himself with the constraints of respectable society, Bonnet made a fateful decision. He would return to piracy. This time, however, he sought to reinvent himself entirely. Assuming the alias Captain Thomas, Bonnet set out to rebuild his reputation on the high seas. He gathered a new crew, this time more seasoned and willing to follow a man who had, at least once, commanded his own ship. But the road back to piracy was not an easy one. The shadow of his past failures loomed large, and Bonnet struggled to gain the credibility and respect he so desperately craved. His renewed piracy activities were marked by a series of small, often unremarkable raids, far from the bold exploits of his peers like Blackbeard. Bonnet's return to piracy was fraught with challenges. His attempts to strike fear into the hearts of merchants and sailors were often met with scepticism or outright defiance. The tales of his earlier incompetence had spread far and wide, and many viewed him as little more than a curiosity, a nobleman playing at piracy rather than a true scourge of the seas. Despite his best efforts, Bonnet's activities under his new alias failed to bring him the glory he sought. The Caribbean was becoming an increasingly hostile place for pirates, with colonial forces cracking down hard on those who dared defy the law. As Bonnet continued his ill-fated return to piracy, the net around him began to tighten. His renewed life of crime had put him back on the radar of the authorities, who were now more determined than ever to stamp out piracy for good. His brief stint under the guise of Captain Thomas only served to further complicate his situation, making him a marked man on both sides of the law. His struggle to assert himself in a world that had no place for a gentleman pirate would lead to his final capture and trial, a last stand that would test his resolve and define his legacy. Stede Bonnet's final chapter as a pirate began with a fateful encounter near the Cape Fear River in September 1718. After his brief return to piracy under the alias Captain Thomas, Bonnet became a target for colonial forces determined to rid the Carolina coast of the pirate threat once and for all. Leading the charge against him was Colonel William Rhett, a seasoned privateer with a reputation for ruthlessness. Rhett had been hunting Bonnet for weeks, and when he finally cornered the gentleman pirate near Cape Fear, he saw an opportunity to strike. Bonnet, realizing the peril he was in, attempted to flee. However, Rhett's squadron of heavily armed sloops had the advantage of both numbers and firepower. The chase was on. The naval engagement that unfolded was a tense and desperate affair. Bonnet's ship, though fast, was no match for Rhett's superior firepower. As the two sides closed in, the river's treacherous sandbars became an unexpected battleground, grounding both Bonnet's and Rhett's ships at low tide. With his back against the wall, Bonnet ordered his men to prepare for a last stand. As the sun rose, the tide lifted Rhett's ships first, giving him the manoeuvrability advantage. He quickly pressed the attack, using his superior position to pound Bonnet's vessel with cannon fire. Bonnet's men, desperate and outgunned, fought back fiercely, but were soon overwhelmed by Rhett's relentless assault. The critical moment came when Rhett's forces finally boarded Bonnet's ship. Despite the chaotic melee, Bonnet tried to rally his crew for one last charge. However, it was clear that their cause was lost. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, Bonnet's men began to falter. With his ship on the verge of sinking and his crew either dead or surrendering, Bonnet realized he had no choice but to capitulate. Raising a white flag, he formally surrendered to Rhett, who quickly took him into custody. This surrender marked the end of Bonnet's piratical exploits and set the stage for his inevitable reckoning with the law. Once captured, Bonnet was transported to Charleston, South Carolina, where he was to stand trial for his crimes. The trial of Stede Bonnet quickly became a public spectacle, drawing crowds from all over the colony. Charleston's court was packed with curious onlookers, eager to catch a glimpse of the infamous gentleman pirate. The charges brought against Bonnet were severe: multiple counts of piracy, murder, and high treason. The prosecution, armed with testimonies from both captured crew members and victims of Bonnet's raids, painted a damning picture of a man who had willingly chosen a life of crime and terror on the high seas. The evidence against Bonnet was overwhelming. Witness after witness recounted tales of violence and plunder, each account further cementing his guilt in the eyes of the court. The prosecution's strategy was straightforward. Portray Bonnet as a man who had betrayed his class and country for the allure of piracy. They presented detailed records of his ship's movements, the goods he had stolen, and the lives he had disrupted. The testimonies were often graphic, leaving little doubt about the impact of Bonnet's actions. Even among the more seasoned pirates, Bonnet's transformation from gentleman to pirate was seen as a particularly egregious breach of societal norms. Bonnet's defence was a mix of desperation and denial. He claimed that he had been forced into piracy by his men, arguing that he had never truly wanted to become a pirate and had only done so under duress. This argument, however, was quickly dismantled by the prosecution, who presented evidence of Bonnet's voluntary actions, purchasing his ship, the Revenge, hiring a crew, and making the deliberate decision to attack merchant vessels. Bonnet's demeanour throughout the trial was one of increasing despair. Gone was the bravado of the gentleman pirate. In its place was a man who seemed broken, aware that his fate was all but sealed. He tried to appeal to the court's sense of mercy, emphasising his prior status as a gentleman and his attempts to reform under the King's Act of Grace. Despite these pleas, the sentiment in Charleston was overwhelmingly against him. The public, fed up with the disruption caused by pirates along the coast, saw Bonnet's trial as a chance to make an example out of a man who had crossed the line too many times. Newspapers and pamphlets circulated accounts of the trial, often embellishing details to heighten the drama and inflame public opinion. To many, Bonnet represented the dangers of unchecked lawlessness, and his trial was a necessary step in restoring order to the colony. The judges were swift in their decision. After hearing the arguments and weighing the evidence, they found Stede Bonnet guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to hang for his crimes, a fate that was almost a foregone conclusion given the weight of the evidence against him and the public demand for justice. With his conviction, Bonnet's final days began, a sombre period marked by reflection, regret, and a desperate bid to avoid his inevitable fate. Confined to a cell in Charleston, Bonnet used every means at his disposal to delay his execution. He filed appeals, petitioned for clemency, and even attempted to bribe his way to freedom. Despite his efforts, the colonial authorities were unyielding. They were determined to see justice served, and no amount of pleading or bargaining would sway them. In a final act of desperation, Bonnet attempted to escape from his cell, but his plan was foiled before it could even begin. This failed escape only served to harden the public's perception of him as a man beyond redemption. Now, more than ever, there was a sense that Bonnet's execution was not just a punishment, but a necessary closure to his story. As Bonnet awaited his final moments, he was a man caught between two worlds: the gentleman he once was, and the pirate he had become. His journey from a Barbados plantation owner to a pirate on the run had been fraught with contradiction, marked by choices that defied logic and a fate that now seemed execution end his story, or would it mark the beginning of a legacy that would endure far beyond the gallows? That answer would come soon enough as Bonnet faced his execution and cemented his place in the annals of piracy. The morning of December the 10th, 1718, dawned cold and clear in Charleston, South Carolina. A sombre crowd gathered at White Point Garden, where a gallows had been hastily erected. This was the day Stede Bonnet, the so-called gentleman pirate, would meet his end. In the days leading up to his execution, Bonnet had tried everything to delay the inevitable, from pleading for clemency to attempting a desperate escape. But now there were no more avenues left to pursue. As the guards led him to the scaffold, the crowd murmured in a mix of curiosity and solemnity. Bonnet, dressed in a simple shirt and breeches, walked with a calm that belied the tumultuous life he had led. Eyewitnesses later remarked on his dignified demeanour, noting that even in his final moments he maintained the bearing of a gentleman. As the noose was placed around his neck, Bonnet offered a final prayer. The executioner read out his crimes, a litany of piracy and treachery that had brought him to this point. Then, with a swift pull of the lever, the trapdoor beneath Bonnet's feet fell away. His body jerked, then hung still. For a moment there was silence, a collective holding of breath. Then the crowd erupted in a murmur of voices, some satisfied, others whispering in a mix of fear and fascination. The execution of Stede Bonnet was not just the end of a man, but the closing chapter of a tale that had captivated and confounded the public. The message was clear. The colonial authorities would no longer tolerate the scourge of piracy on their shores. Bonnet's execution had a ripple effect on the perception of piracy in the region. Here was a man who had once been a respected member of society, a wealthy plantation owner who by some twist of fate or folly had chosen to live as a pirate. His story became a powerful cautionary tale, a stark warning of the perils that awaited those who strayed from the path of respectability. Colonial authorities seized upon his tale as a tool for deterrence, showcasing the swift and severe justice that awaited any who dared to follow in his footsteps. They used Bonnet's downfall as a symbol of the Crown's newfound resolve to eradicate piracy, demonstrating that not even a gentleman of status would be spared from the rope if he turned to a life of crime. Public perception of piracy shifted in the wake of Bonnet's death. The romantic notion of the dashing, swashbuckling pirate was tempered by the stark reality of Bonnet's fate. A man who had overreached, who had been undone by his own inexperience and miscalculations. His story served as a grim reminder that the life of a pirate was not all adventure and treasure, but was fraught with danger, betrayal, and the ever-present threat of a violent end. Bonnet's tale was one of tragedy wrapped in folly, a narrative that served to humanize pirates, while also underscoring the futility and peril of their trade. It painted the pirate not as a mythical figure, but as a flawed human being, susceptible to the same fears, desires, and failures as any other. Yet, despite, or perhaps because of, his ignominious end, Bonnet's story continued to captivate the public imagination. Over time, he became an almost mythic figure in pirate lore, his name synonymous with the concept of the gentleman pirate. Unlike Blackbeard or Captain Kidd, Bonnet's appeal lay not in his fearsome reputation, but in his unlikely transformation from privileged landowner to pirate. His story has been portrayed in books, plays, and films, often as a blend of comedy, tragedy, and adventure. The image of a genteel, somewhat hapless pirate captain bumbling through his misadventures has proven irresistible to storytellers looking for a unique twist on the pirate narrative. Modern fascination with Bonnet's story continues to this day. In recent years, he has appeared in a variety of media, from historical novels to television series, often portrayed as a tragicomic figure. A man out of his depth, driven by a mix of midlife crisis and misguided ambition. His life and career serve as a rich tapestry for those who wish to explore the contradictions and complexities of human nature. Bonnet's tale is often used as a counterpoint to the more straightforward depictions of piracy, reminding us that history is not just a collection of grand, heroic narratives, but also includes the stories of those who failed, floundered, and fell short of their dreams. Bonnet's legacy, unlike that of his more ruthless peers, is a complex one. He has become a symbol of both the dangers of unchecked ambition and the enduring allure of a life lived beyond societal bounds. His tale is one of risk and reward, of folly and consequence, a narrative that continues to resonate with those who find themselves drawn to the romance and danger of piracy. As we explore his life and motivations further, we delve into the curious case of Stede Bonnet, examining the psychological underpinnings of his choices, comparing him to his contemporaries, and seeking to understand what drove this unlikely pirate on his doomed quest for freedom. The morning of December the 10th, 1718, dawned cold and clear in Charleston, South Carolina. A sombre crowd gathered at White Point Garden, where a gallows had been hastily erected. This was the day Stede Bonnet, the so-called gentleman pirate, would meet his end. In the days leading up to his execution, Bonnet had tried everything to delay the inevitable, from pleading for clemency to attempting a desperate escape. But now there were no more avenues left to pursue. As the guards led him to the scaffold, the crowd murmured in a mix of curiosity and solemnity. Bonnet, dressed in a simple shirt and breeches, walked with a calm that belied the tumultuous life he had led. Eyewitnesses later remarked on his dignified demeanour, noting that even in his final moments he maintained the bearing of a gentleman. As the noose was placed around his neck, Bonnet offered a final prayer. The executioner read out his crimes, a litany of piracy and treachery that had brought him to this point. Then, with a swift pull of the faces, some satisfied, others whispering in a mix of fear and fascination. The execution of Stede Bonnet was not just the end of a man, but the closing chapter of a tale that had captivated and confounded the public. The message was clear. The colonial authorities would no longer tolerate the scourge of piracy on their shores. Bonnet's execution had a ripple effect on the perception of piracy in the region. Here was a man who had once been a respected member of society, a wealthy plantation owner who by some twist of fate or folly had chosen to live as a pirate. His story became a powerful cautionary tale, a stark warning of the perils that awaited those who strayed from the path of respectability. Colonial authorities seized upon his tale as a tool for deterrence, showcasing the swift and severe justice that awaited any who dared to follow in his footsteps. They used Bonnet's downfall as a symbol of the Crown's newfound resolve to eradicate piracy, demonstrating that not even a gentleman of status would be spared from the rope if he turned to a life of crime. Public perception of piracy shifted in the wake of Bonnet's death. The romantic notion of the dashing, swashbuckling pirate was tempered by the stark reality of Bonnet's fate. A man who had overreached, who had been undone by his own inexperience and miscalculations. His story served as a grim reminder that the life of a pirate was not all adventure and treasure, but was fraught with danger, betrayal, and the ever-present threat of a violent end. Bonnet's tale was one of tragedy wrapped in folly, a narrative that served to humanize pirates while also underscoring the futility and peril of their trade. It painted the pirate not as a mythical figure, but as a flawed human being, susceptible to the same fears, desires, and failures as any other. Yet, despite, or perhaps because of, his ignominious end, Bonnet's story continued to captivate the public imagination. Over time, he became an almost mythic figure in pirate lore, his name synonymous with the concept of the gentleman pirate. Unlike Blackbeard or Captain Kidd, Bonnet's appeal lay not in his fearsome reputation, but in his unlikely transformation from privileged landowner to pirate. His story has been portrayed in books, plays, and films, often as a blend of comedy, tragedy, and adventure. The image of a genteel, somewhat hapless pirate captain bumbling through his misadventures has proven irresistible to storytellers looking for a unique twist on the pirate narrative. Modern fascination with Bonnet's story continues to this day. In recent years, he has appeared in a variety of media, from historical novels to television series, often portrayed as a tragicomic figure. A man out of his depth, driven by a mix of midlife crisis and misguided ambition. His life and career serve as a rich tapestry for those who wish to explore the contradictions and complexities of human nature. Bonnet's tale is often used as a counterpoint to the more straightforward depictions of piracy, reminding us that history is not just a collection of grand, heroic narratives, but also includes the stories of those who failed, floundered, and fell short of their dreams. ruthless peers is a complex one. He has become a symbol of both the dangers of unchecked ambition and the enduring allure of a life lived beyond societal bounds. His tale is one of risk and reward, of folly and consequence, a narrative that continues to resonate with those who find themselves drawn to the romance and danger of piracy. As we explore his life and motivations further, we delve into the curious case of Stede Bonnet, examining the psychological underpinnings of his choices, comparing him to his contemporaries, and seeking to understand what drove this unlikely pirate on his doomed quest for freedom. Stede Bonnet's life was a journey of stark contrasts, a tale of privilege and downfall, ambition and incompetence, comedy and tragedy. Born into a wealthy family in Barbados, Bonnet seemed destined for a life of comfort and ease. Yet, he chose a path that defied logic and reason, abandoning his plantation for the unpredictable seas and the life of a pirate. His transformation from gentleman planter to the so-called gentleman pirate was as ill-fated as it was improbable. Lacking the skills, experience, and ruthlessness necessary for piracy, Bonnet's career was a series of blunders and missteps that ultimately led to his capture, trial, and execution. It was a path marked by a desperate search for freedom and adventure, but one that ended in a grim dance with the gallows. And yet, despite his failures, Bonnet's story endures. Perhaps it is precisely because of his shortcomings that his tale continues to intrigue us. He was not the fearsome pirate of legend, but a man out of place, navigating a world he neither understood nor could master. His life was a tragic comedy, a reminder that history is full of the unexpected, of people who defy their destiny for better or worse. Bonnet's story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of ambition without preparation, of the folly of abandoning one's world without truly understanding the one you're stepping into. It's a story that captures the imagination, showing that even in a world as harsh and unforgiving as piracy, there was room for the unlikeliest of figures. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life of Stede Bonnet, the gentleman pirate. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the ASMR History Hub, and share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what historical stories you'd like me to whisper next. Be sure to stay tuned for more soothing tales from the shadows of history. And now, as we close the book on tonight's story, let the gentle waves of history lull you into a peaceful slumber. Remember, every story has a lesson, and every whisper has a secret. Until next time, sleep well and dream of the seas.